Hello and welcome. My name's Rachel. Hopefully for you it's welcome back, and you've already watched part 1 of this series about Michael Alig and the murder of Angel Melendez. In part 1 we talked about Michael Alig, his climb to fame, how he became the king of the club kids against really insurmountable odds. He was a young boy from Indiana, very poor, and somehow he rose to the top of the club scene in New York City in the late 80s and early 90s, especially in the early 90s. That was really his heyday. So if you haven't watched part 1 yet, there's a link in the description of this video that you can go watch it, and I highly recommend you do, because if you don't, you're going to lose a lot of context. In this video, part 2, and the riveting conclusion, we'll discuss how he went from club king to party monster. We're going to talk about the crime itself, and probably talk about some pretty crappy police work. I'm assuming if you're watching this, you're a big true crime fan like me. Isn't it amazing how often sort of questionable police work plays a role? We'll also talk about James St. James's book. James St. James, you'll remember, as the best frenemy of Michael Alig. We're gonna get a little more into the book that he wrote, the memoir of this time and of Michael Alig's crime. And we'll also talk a little bit about the movie in 2003, plus some other pop culture stuff, a couple of documentaries that sort of play an important role and influenced public opinion pretty heavily about what happened. And we will talk about what actually happened and how it differs from what the popular perception is. Or at least we can discuss what we're pretty sure happened. I suppose in this case, it's sort of up to interpretation, what you believe and what you don't believe, but I'll leave that to you. And we'll also talk about some of the events happening that led up to Michael's untimely death. So when we left off on part 1, we were discussing how Michael's addiction had really started to get the better of him. We were talking about how his boss and mentor, Peter Gatien, was involved in a DEA investigation and therefore was running out of money and therefore no longer supporting Michael, his habit, or his lifestyle. And it was beginning to put Michael into a bit of a desperate situation. Everything that he had built up over the last decade as a well-known and celebrated party promoter in New York City was really crumbling around him. And when we get to mid-March of 1996, when people start noticing that Angel Melendez has gone missing, I can only assume that Michael had a sinking feeling that the party was almost over. And on top of that, rumors had started to spread among the club scene that Angel wasn't missing. He had been murdered. And word on the street was that Michael Alig and his roommate Robert Freeze Riggs had something to do with that murder, like as in they killed him. So because we're focusing on self-care and true crime, or care and crime, or self-care and scare, no, that's really bad. Last time we did some skincare, but part of self-care sometimes is just feeling pretty and feeling good about yourself. So today I'm gonna do my makeup while I tell you about this story. On top of learning about this, we'll just see if I could maybe start a career as a professional catfish. I don't think I'm that good, but we'll see. So like I said, as Angel's missingness, that's not the right word, as Angel's absence becomes more and more noticed, rumors start spreading that maybe Michael and Freeze killed Angel. And the reason that these rumors were spreading and were so pervasive is because Michael Alig was telling people that he and Freeze had killed Angel. The guy literally would not stop running his mouth. All kinds of crazy stuff started to be said. The most pervasive stories were that Michael had gotten into a fight with Angel over a debt for drugs. You'll remember from part 1 that Angel was a drug dealer. And I'd like to point out right now that the disclaimer I gave in the last video goes for this video too, okay? We're going to talk about him being a drug dealer because that's widely accepted, but I would like to point out he was never convicted of that or anything like that, so it is alleged. And he was also living with Michael and Freeze at the time. So these various rumors say that they got into a fight over a drug debt, that Angel had tried to attack Michael, that Freeze and Michael beat him with a hammer till he was unconscious, that Michael then smothered him with a pillow, that they injected Drano into his bloodstream in order to, I don't know, make sure he was dead or something, and then that they stuffed him into a box or a trash bag or something and they discarded of his body. Now this all sounds pretty wild, and you're not gonna believe me, but nobody believed Michael when he was telling these stories. Such was Michael's personality. He was always sensation seeking. He was always looking to grab attention, and it would not have been out of character for him to capitalize on someone's disappearance and try to bring attention to himself by claiming that he had gotten rid of them. So for the most part, everybody just laughed this off, and Michael went on just yapping about it all over town, and pretty soon everybody knew the story that Michael had killed Angel. But again, he talked so much crap all the time that everybody just thought it was Michael being Michael. Michael's drug use was getting worse than ever. I mean, he was really on a downward spiral. Eventually, these rumors about Michael and Freeze become so pervasive that people almost start to question it, especially after Angel doesn't show up for like months. At some point, a man named Michael Musto, who was a gossip columnist for the Village Voice, a friend of James St. James, and sometimes frenemy of Michael Alig, wrote an article about the details of the murder. Of course, it was at this point only an alleged killing, and also the quote-unquote details were sketchy at best, because they were really just based on all of these rumors, and it was like a big game of telephone, right? So Michael says to one person, oh yeah, we killed him and we cut him up and we threw him in the river. And then that just gets, you know, sort of passed down along and turned into something completely of its own. I can only imagine that there were some people, particularly people who didn't like Michael very much already, and believe me, there were plenty of those, who may have even begun to omit the details about Angel having attacked Michael first, etc., etc. And I think that there were probably a fair amount of people who really started to think, well, maybe Michael is just a cold-blooded murderer. Anyway, back to Michael Musto. He writes an article with the supposed details, and he omits any names of the alleged parties. He calls them, you know, Mr. Mess and Mr. Dealer, or something along those lines. The nice thing about Michael Musto's job as a gossip columnist is that he didn't really have to worry too much about printing the absolute truth. You know, back then they didn't have these drama YouTube channels and tea spill channels and all of that. Back then, spilling tea was called gossip, and that's what Michael Musto basically did. He was a tea spill channel, only on paper. What he mostly did was hang around the club kids and the club scene and then sort of chronicle about what they were doing. Very much like we see drama channels doing with, you know, big name YouTubers and TikTok stars today. The journalistic integrity wasn't necessarily the highest. Not terribly long after people in New York started to notice that Angel was missing, somebody else noticed his absence as well, and that was his brother, Johnny. A lot of people say that Johnny Melendez and Angel could have been twins. They weren't. They were about a year apart. But Johnny loved his brother and did try to talk to him occasionally. He didn't quite understand the lifestyle he was living, but he loved him. And he had been unable to get a hold of Angel for some time. Angel had a beeper, and they usually communicated that way. And he was beeping him and beeping him and beeping him and just not getting any response. So Johnny actually goes to the police. He calls up the police in New York City, and he reports that Angel is missing. And even though his brother had reported him missing, nothing was really done about it. The cops really didn't look into it at all. And there were several reasons for this. Number one, they had no identified bodies. Well, that they knew of. We'll get to that later. And also, Angel was a known drug dealer among these club kids who were already known for being fairly migratory. They'd come into the scene, they'd go out of the scene, they'd move to New York City from their small towns in the Midwest, and then breeze out just as quickly. On top of it, and remember, this is 1996, so quite a bit ago. I don't know that much has changed in this direction, but Andre was a Colombian immigrant, and his immigration status at this time was a little bit dubious. He was also openly gay, and I just think the cops weren't convinced that their time was well spent looking for a possibly undocumented gay drug dealing club kid. Again, that's just my opinion. That's just what I see in this situation. I'm sure the NYPD does a fantastic job, but I think that there was a lot of that going into why Angel's disappearance really was utterly ignored, despite the fact that there were people missing him. And quite frankly, this is a little bit of a conspiracy that sort of goes around through this whole situation. But keep in mind that the DEA was trying to take down Peter Gatien as sort of a drug kingpin because of all of the drugs that were coming in and out of his club. Oh my gosh, have I looked this pale the whole time? Wow. I look like a ghost. Hang on, I gotta turn down the light. Okay, that's a little bit better. The DEA was after Peter Gatien, and Michael was the DEA's star witness in this investigation. So it's possible, and I'm not saying this is true, but it's possible that even though everybody was talking about the fact that Michael Alig may have killed this person, and the cops have a missing persons report on this individual, they may have been encouraged not to look into it, because the DEA really needed Michael to make anything stick to Peter. So maybe they were kind of putting off the local cops a little bit. Perhaps. It's a theory. We'll never know for sure. On June 25th of 1996, Frank Owen, who's another columnist for the Village Voice, publishes an article called, "Did Michael Alig Really Kill Angel Melendez, or Is It All a Hoax?" Now this is a full 3 months after Angel went missing. And this is a newspaper that's printing this article. So it really wasn't much of a secret that lots of people thought that Michael was involved in this. And you cannot tell me that the cops didn't know this. I don't believe it. I don't believe that they were just totally ignorant to this whole thing. My main question is, why did Michael go around telling everybody that he had done this? He had done it, and you would think that he would want to avoid suspicion and not talk about it. There are some different varying opinions. A lot of friends of Michael think that he talked about it so often and admitted to it in this joking, lighthearted way because he felt so guilty that he couldn't hold it inside, that he had to talk about it because he felt so guilty about what had happened. And other people, maybe people who didn't like Michael as much, said that it was just pure narcissism, that he thought that he was untouchable, and that possibly he thought that even if he was caught, he would somehow gain immunity for the crime by leveraging his testimony against Peter Gatien. Personally, I think that the most likely situation is that he just wanted attention. This was Michael. Michael loved to get attention in any situation, any way he could. It didn't matter if it was good attention, bad attention. He just wanted people looking at him. He wanted to have his name in everybody's mouth. So all of this talk about Michael Alig and him being guilty of this horrible crime keeps going on and on for months. Months. Everybody's talking about this within the club scene. It was an absolute open secret. Now remember how I told you that one of the reasons the cops hadn't done anything about it was because there was no body? Well, there was. And this is what I'm talking about with this poopy police work here. There had been a body found back in April, just a couple weeks after Angel went missing. The legless torso of a young man washed up in a cardboard box on Long Island. And that body would not be identified until October. Despite the fact that people were looking for Angel, despite the fact that Michael had admitted to doing something to him and everybody knew it, nobody thought to say, hey, have there been any unidentified bodies washing up on the shores of Long Island lately? And that's really just incredible to me, because Angel's family could have gotten some peace much, much sooner. What exactly was Michael doing in the 7 months between when Angel disappeared and when his body was finally identified? Well, the first thing he did was he went and bought some new furniture. Michael and Freeze's place had been an absolute shithole. They basically stayed up for days doing substances and then would stay out all night partying and then would maybe come back and do the same thing until they crashed. All of their furniture was disgusting and gross. Everybody says that it stank and just looked generally like a house that belonged to some people who didn't take care of their home. But then friends started noticing that Michael had all brand new furniture. And suddenly his apartment was looking a lot cleaner than it had been. I don't know if maybe they just thought he was finally getting his stuff together. Maybe because he had to clean up after a murder. Just saying. Anyway, as the heat started to be on and he started to get more and more worried about all of these rumors and people sort of starting to take them seriously, he actually left New York. He was going to go to Colorado, and he went with this friend of his named Gitzy. Now, Gitzy was a girl who he had only known maybe about a year. They mostly just got high together. And in the movie, Michael's relationship with Gitzy gets a lot more prominence than it actually had in real life. There's sort of a mild suggestion in the film that there was some sort of intimate relationship. There wasn't. That was absolute fiction that they threw in there. My guess would be to make the movie more palatable. Even in 2003, we were less gay friendly still than we are now. So he goes with Gitzy to Colorado under this guise that they're going to get sober. By the time Michael and Gitzy hit Indiana, Michael is in full withdrawal. And so they stop at Michael's mother's house and they spend about 5 days in Indiana. Michael goes to a methadone clinic to keep himself from getting dope sick. If you don't know, methadone is a medication that they often give people who are withdrawing on drugs, I believe particularly opiate drugs. It just sort of mimics the same effects and can help them through the time, because withdrawing can be very hard for somebody who's been using for a really long time. So they spend 5 days in Indiana with Michael's mom, and they go ahead and head on to Denver, Colorado. And I believe that they were trying to go out there because that's where Michael's older brother lived. I don't know, but all this talk about getting clean just really got Michael and Gitzy thinking that they should break into a veterinary clinic and steal some ketamine. Remember that animal tranquilizer that they were all such fans of? Yeah, I don't think there was probably a whole lot of getting clean going on this supposed detoxing trip. I could be wrong, but I don't think so. So they do spend a little time in Colorado, but eventually Michael comes back to New York City. And I don't know why. And I couldn't really figure out exactly why, or if anybody knew why he would come back. Again, some people say that it was because he felt guilty and that he really had gone out to Colorado to try to get clean because he knew he was going to get arrested eventually. And so he was trying to get clean so he didn't have to go into prison being addicted to drugs. But, but he came back because he wanted to face up and face justice for his crime. There's also the more likely theory that after several months of all of this information being out there and Angel's body having never been found, quote unquote, because you and I know that they had found it, but they didn't know that they had found it. Anyway, after months of this and nothing coming of it, Michael just felt comfortable that maybe he was going to get away with this and he could go ahead and come back and try to pick up the pieces of his life and continue on with being the king. And that's exactly what he did. Now, of course, he had already been evicted from his apartment that he had lived in, so he moves in with his friend Brooke. And Brooke seems like a pretty good friend, She took Michael in, even though he didn't have a job anymore, even though he didn't have a single penny to his name. She was like, yeah, bro, come on and come, live with me and we'll hang out. And Michael decides that he's going to try to have himself a little comeback, and he gets to work. A newspaper called, or maybe a magazine, I think it's a newspaper, called the Daily Mail had printed an article about the Limelight, which had since been closed, calling it a honeypot, basically suggesting that they were luring the children in to come and do all the drugs. And in a later interview, Brooke, this woman that Michael had started to live with, said it in such a way like it was the most ridiculous notion ever. And it's not ridiculous. That's exactly what they were doing. I'm sorry. It's not funny. It's terrible and sad, but that's literally exactly what they were doing, was luring young kids, 15, 16, 17 years old, into this lifestyle. So I don't really know why she thought that that was such a ridiculous notion and that they were being silly for calling it that. But the point is, they called it a honeypot. This gives Michael a great idea. He's gonna have a big comeback party. I couldn't figure out if the party was called the honeypot or if it was the venue itself that they called the honeypot, but he tried to get started back up, and I saw some footage of this place, I believe in the documentary Party Monster, the Shockumentary, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But this place literally looked like somebody's basement office space. I mean, it was a far cry from the lavishness and the just overwhelming, amazing venue that had been the limelight. This place was like, do you watch The Office? And the episode where Michael decides he's going to open a dance club down in like one of the basement rooms of the office space that they rent. That's what it looked like. Ultimately, this idea of the honeypot does fail. And I have to assume that it's mostly because people sort of thought by now that Michael was a murderer and they just didn't really want to be associated with him. I can only assume. I don't know that for a fact. It could just be because Michael had lost his touch. After the failure of the honeypot, Michael gets this new boyfriend named Brian. He looks pretty young. Rumor has it he liked them pretty young. He moves to Brian's place in New Jersey. So he was a good old bridge and tunnel boy now. And Brian's house in New Jersey is exactly where he was on one night in December when the cops came knocking on the door. They pull Michael out of the apartment. They begin to ask him some questions about Angel Melendez, and they do arrest him and take him back to New York City. They had arrested Freeze at a different location on the same night. Look, I'm telling you, my makeup looks really good in the mirror. This lighting is making me look like a Cupid doll. Freeze basically starts talking right away and confesses to everything. Within a few hours of being brought in, they have a full written and signed confession from him. And this is really the first time that we get the full story straight from the horse's mouth. No rumors, no game of telephone, no cryptic, no-named gossip articles in the Village Voice. This is the actual first-hand account of what happened in Michael and Freeze's apartment the day that Angel Melendez was killed. And that story goes a little something like this. Robert Riggs was in his bedroom when he heard a scuffle outside in the common area and the sound of something breaking. Robert rushes out into the living room to see Angel attacking Michael. Michael yells for help. Freeze grabs a hammer and hits Angel over the head with it. Angel falls, but Freeze continues to hit him over the head several times, basically until he stops moving. Michael then puts a pillow over Angel's face, attempting to suffocate him, because they assumed that he was still alive. At this point, Freeze claims he left the room and went somewhere else, although he doesn't really get specific about where it was that he went. And this is only speculation, but I'm guessing it was somewhere where he could go get high. Riggs then returns to the room where Michael is with Angel's now lifeless body, and he notes in his confession that he sees some kind of household cleaner in the room along with a broken syringe, and that he sees Michael pouring something, probably that household cleaner, into Angel's throat. Together, Michael and Freeze undress Angel's body and dump him into their bathtub. And Freeze states that they left Angel's body in that bathtub for between 5 and 7 days. He's not exactly sure how long. And he says after that period of time, he looks at Michael and remarks, "We have to do something about this terrible mess." Michael tells Freeze that for 10 bags of heroin, he'll do it. He'll get rid of the body. And apparently, Riggs thought that was a hell of a deal, because he goes and he gets Michael his drugs and he comes back to the apartment with that along with some cutlery. Michael does all 10 bags of heroin, and then he goes into the bathroom and begins to cut Angel's legs, separating them from his body. Together, Angel and Michael put the legs into 2 trash bags that they then go and dump in a river. Then Riggs retrieves a large box from a common area in the apartment building where they would put kind of cardboard trash and stuff like that. In the side little margin of this signed confession, he writes, "I cut the UPC code off the box." I'm not sure why he would put that or how it's relevant, except that if they had found this box and noted that the UPC code was cut off, this is something that they may have wanted Freeze to confess to because it would show some kind of like attempt to get away with something, some kind of forward thinking, like they weren't just impulsively doing this to try to clean up the scene. To remove the UPC code off of the box would certainly speak to trying to keep it from being traced back to that building and therefore back to them. So maybe that's something that the police asked him about, or I don't know. You know how this goes. The police, for some reason, probably thought that it was important and they wanted to make sure to get it in the confession so that they could pin it on somebody. They take this box that Freeze had brought back and they put Angel's body in it. And then, Freeze says, a couple of days later, they go to dispose of the torso by calling a taxi, putting the dismembered corpse in a box in the taxi, driving it down the ways to a river further away from where they live, and tossing it over a bridge into the water. Now, I have so many questions about this, okay? Because we're talking about a body that has been dead for at least, at the bare minimum, 7 days. There's no way that you could put that in a taxi and have nobody notice the smell. And I'm not trying to be flip here, and maybe I don't know exactly what, but it seems like you put this thing in the trunk of a car and it's gonna stink up the place. I don't see any way around it. I don't see how it could not. So I don't know what this taxi driver was doing with his life, that he just apparently didn't think that it was important to mention the rancid smell to the police at any point. But whatever, he obviously didn't. Or maybe he did and the police just thought he was kidding, because in those early days, nobody seemed to care. I would like to point out at this time that Freeze's recollection of these events and Michael's recollection of these events after the fact were different. Michael would give several interviews in prison where he contested some of this information that Freeze had given, but we will talk about that in a minute. But at the time, Michael corroborates the story. He agrees that it happened exactly the way that Riggs said it happened, and then they both go to prison for the rest of their lives for their terrible crime. The end. I almost had you there for a minute, didn't I? They do not go to prison for the rest of their lives. They get pled out to first-degree manslaughter. They both get the same charge, not murder. So technically, by law, Michael is not a murderer. He's a manslaughterer. And they both get sentenced to 10 to 20 years. My personal opinion on this is that that is a very light sentence for what they did. This was not just a matter of self-defense, which, by the way, there was no evidence for or against self-defense, because by the time they had the body and could look at it, there was really no physical evidence. That apartment that they had lived in, they had moved out of, other people had been in there, it had been remodeled. There was zero physical evidence for or against any kind of self-defense, okay? I think, once again, there was a little bit of bias going on. They knew that Angel had been a drug dealer, and they just sort of thought, well, that seems like a likely story. They probably did fight over a drug debt. And that's fine. I agree. I do think that that's a likely story. But it still doesn't change the fact that they kept a body for days in a bathtub, dismembered it, and then dumped it into a river and got away with it for 7 months. Actually, more like 9 months, because they weren't actually arrested until December. But in this case, I do sort of understand the cops, conundrum here. Although they didn't have any evidence to prove that it was self-defense, they really didn't have any evidence to prove that it wasn't, and that's a double-edged sword. So I do think that they thought that the first-degree manslaughter was the best that they were going to get. There was a he said situation, and both of them were agreeing, and there was nobody there to disagree with them. The only 3 people who knew exactly what happened were Robert Freeze Riggs, Michael Alig, and Andre Angel Melendez. And Andre couldn't talk. So that's what happened. They got sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison, and that was that. A year after Michael went to prison is when James St. James wrote his book, Disco Bloodbath, which would later be changed to Party Monster to match the title of the 2003 movie that was made starring Macaulay Culkin and Seth Green. I'm mentioning this again just in case some of you were disobedient and did not go back and watch part 1 and you don't know what I'm talking about. In the book, James St. James takes a little bit of creative license. He sets up some situations that did not happen, such as the book opens with James rushing into Michael Alig's apartment and then Michael confessing the whole crime to him right there while serving him tea and cookies or something like that. According to Michael Alig, that never happened. And according to Michael Alig, James St. James admits that that never happened. And given what I now understand to be the nature of their relationship after doing all of this research, I believe it. I don't think that that probably actually happened. I think that James needed a literary way to introduce the book and to introduce himself and Michael as characters in this book. And so he sort of, fudged that one particular detail. Furthermore, a lot of the details that James gives of the crime are really based more in kind of those rumors that had been circulating before Michael and Freeze got caught, and less with like what was actually confessed to. I think it's a literary device. I think that it was important for selling the books, and also nobody really does know what happened there. I think it's likely that Freeze was giving pretty close to the truth. Just based on his personality, it seems likely that that's pretty close to what actually happened. We can never really know. One of the things that was included in both the book and the movie is this idea that they had injected Angel with Drano. I assume that this was a rumor that was spread. I think that the fact that Robert Riggs had said that there was some kind of cleaner in the room, that he thought he saw Michael pouring this cleaner down Angel's throat, that there was a broken syringe nearby, that all sort of lent legitimacy to this idea that they had killed Angel by injecting him with Drano. Like somehow he had survived all the hammer blows and the pillow over the face, and they just needed to do this one last thing. Like, it was already a bad crime. I don't feel like we need to be exaggerating to make it look even worse than it already was. And that does seem to be what the Drano situation is about. Later, when Michael was talking about this, he would say, "I'm sure Freeze did see a broken syringe on the floor. We were junkies. There were syringes all over the apartment." And those are his words, not mine. I know that we don't say junkies anymore. That's what he called himself, not me. Around the same time that James published the book, a production company called World of Wonder, which James still works for, released a documentary called Party Monster, the Shockumentary. And this is where the title of the movie came from. This documentary has a lot of footage of contemporary footage of the club kids. It was made right after Michael's arrest, and it has a lot of interviews with important people. And the movie Party Monster would rely very, very heavily on the documentary footage from the Shockumentary for the portrayals of the characters in the film. And if you have not seen the film Party Monster, or you have, but you haven't seen Party Monster, the Shockumentary, I highly recommend that you go do those things. And if you haven't read the book, I highly recommend you do that too. They're all really good, and I know that the film got a lot of criticism for being terrible, but in my opinion, it's not terrible. I think it's a great film, and it's got a lot of really good actors in it. We're highly influenced by film, and even though Disco Bloodbath was a memoir written from James's perspective, and James was not actually there in Michael Alig's apartment when Angel Melendez was being killed, the whole thing and the subsequent movie, it made the general public think that they really knew what had happened. And so all of these things kind of go down in history as fact when they may very well not have been. As a matter of fact, they likely weren't. It's important to note that the cause of Angel's death was listed as blunt force trauma to the head. And they also never found any evidence of anything having been injected into him, no marks, no tox screen, nothing. So although it's always possible that they missed it, that's always a possibility, it seems like the most likely scenario is that he was killed by the hammer blows. It's possible that Michael put a pillow over his face. I don't think he contests that point, but if he did, it wouldn't have mattered because Angel was already dead. And as far as if they injected him, it doesn't look like it. Michael would later say that they poured Drano on the body to try to keep the smell down, which in my opinion, he sort of says flippantly, like, no, we would never inject him with Drano or pour Drano down his throat. I just poured it all over his dead body so that he wouldn't stink. That's not that much better to me. Like, in my opinion, Michael really wanted to make it a point that you know, that's what happened. In 2014, 17 years after Michael Alig had been imprisoned, he was released on parole. A bunch of old friends from the club scene were right there to pick him up, as well as a documentary crew. They were making a documentary called Glory Days. It's also very good if you're interested in this case. It has a lot of updated interviews and things with important people in this case. And then, of course, the entire second half of Glory Days follows Michael around after his release from prison. So his old friends, all these old club kids, they pick him up from prison, they bring him back to New York City, and then Michael lives a fabulous life and never, ever, ever does anything wrong ever again. I swear, I almost had you that time. That is not what happened. What happened is Michael Alig basically jumped right back into doing what he was doing before, promoting parties, or at least he tried to. Right after his release, there was a little bit of a media storm because this was a big thing in New York. People still knew who Michael was, and they were interested in this murderous club kid. So he started doing interviews left and right and left and right. And in one of these interviews, he says to the interviewer, "I think I'll just finally feel normal when I can stop coming on and doing all these interviews and talking about it, and I can just go back to living my life." Now, I don't believe that for a minute. I think Michael loved the attention. He always loved the attention, positive or negative. I don't see how that could possibly change just because he spent a little time in prison. And one of the reasons that I don't think it's changed, assuming that this bit of information is true, I don't think that his need for attention changed, because Michael himself said that at some point when he was in prison, he was diagnosed with histrionic personality disorder. And histrionic personality disorder, first of all, like all personality disorders, it's not something that you can cure. It's only something that you can learn to live with. You know, there are therapeutic treatments and such that you can go with that help you cope with this. But histrionic personality disorder is apparently, again, I'm not a professional anything, but from what I could find online, is marked by just a constant need for attention, to do anything for attention, positive, negative, doesn't matter. You will go to absolute extremes, and it's almost not a conscious choice. It's almost a compulsion. It's just who you are as a person. Because I know what mental health care in prisons in America is like, I don't believe that he probably got the proper mental health care to help him become not this way anymore. So I think when he says that he just can't wait till he can stop all the interviews and just move on and really get to starting his new life, I just don't believe it. I think he liked being in the spotlight again. I think he liked people paying attention to him, and I think he would have kept talking to reporters probably forever. So he's doing these talk shows. He's trying to get back into party promoting, and he does, in fact, promote some parties with DJ Keoki, who I mentioned in part 1, who never stopped being a supporter of Michael, even though they had broken up years and years before. But Keoki never stopped having Michael's back, and he really just sort of lets Michael off on the whole dismemberment and dumping in a river thing. In all the interviews and everything, just seems to have nothing but love for Michael even to this day. Which, you know, I don't really know what to say about that. I get that it's sort of a unique situation, that Michael, in a way, was a victim to his mental health and to his drug addiction. But, like, you still have to hold people accountable for their actions. From what I could see, he was just not really getting the same level of success that he had before he went into prison. I think that there were a lot of people who probably just really didn't want to be associated with him anymore. This probably caused him to have a little bit of depression. He would also hook back up with an old club kid friend called Ernie Glam, and he and Ernie started their own YouTube channel called Peeew, or The Peeew. And I'm going to leave a link to that channel in the description below, because they have literally hundreds of videos, some with Michael and Ernie together, and later some with just Michael. I'll tell you why in just a second. But it's literally hundreds of videos that talk about the crime, what happened, what they're doing now, just literally anything and everything. And it's something that Ernie said that he sort of started for Michael because he thought it would be a good way for him to get readjusted and you know, all of these things. Unfortunately, one of the things that they will commonly tell you in drug treatment is that you can't get well in the environment you got sick in. And Michael, although he came out of prison sober, went right back into the life that had made him an addict in the first place. And this had become a real coping mechanism for Michael, and he did unfortunately fall back into drug use. Eventually he would stop creating anything and really stop trying to promote the parties, and he just completely fell back into his addiction. His friend Ernie, who he had the YouTube channel with, would say that he had to step away from the channel because he just saw Michael getting worse and worse. He did come back for a little while in the hopes that having the YouTube channel again would give Michael a reason to stay sober, and but that really didn't pan out. I believe Michael also ended up with a couple more arrests, mostly involving drugs. I don't know how that wasn't a violation of his parole. Maybe it was after his parole. As I was watching some of these little episodes of the Peeew, I came across a few videos from right after Michael was released from jail with James St. James. They had James St. James on. And in it, I heard something that was so haunting. They're discussing the money that James St. James may have made on the book Party Monster, Disco Bloodbath. And James St. James is telling them, well, like, after I have to pay my agent and blah, 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 I really don't make that much money with it. And he says to Michael, since you were released from prison this year, I'll probably sell a few more copies because interest in this case in your life has been renewed. He looks at James and he says, so like if I overdosed or killed myself or something, sales would go through the roof. It's like he knew that he was destined to not succeed in his sobriety. It's like he knew that something was going to end up happening to him because he knew that the draw of the lifestyle was just too strong for him to resist. And subsequently, on Christmas Eve of 2020, Michael Alig was found alone in his New Jersey apartment, dead of an apparent drug overdose. I feel terrible for Angel's family, but I also can't help but feel a little bit sorry for Michael Alig. You just hate to see a lost soul like that. He almost didn't have a chance. Mental health problems are pervasive. They often lead to drug use as a way of coping. There are a lot of mixed opinions about if Michael really was acting in self-defense or not. I think that the evidence points to that he likely was. There is reason to believe that Angel would have been upset with him about the debt. He would have known that Michael didn't have any money to pay it anymore, and I could see him trying to get that and things escalating from there. In case you're wondering, Robert Riggs was released from prison shortly after Michael was, and he stays out of the public eye completely. He doesn't give interviews. He's not interested in talking about his past. Basically the complete opposite of Michael. When he got out of prison, he went back to college, he got a degree, and from the last I could tell, he was teaching in a college somewhere. And as far as I could find, he never gave an interview or anything. He just went on and lived his life. And to me, that's really the mark of a person who is truly sorrowful for what they've done. He probably feels more responsible because he is technically the one who brought down the hammer, literally. And ultimately, I just hope that everyone involved in this situation gets some kind of peace in whatever way that may be. Thank you so much for being here with me today. I really enjoyed telling you this story, and I hope that you enjoyed hearing it as much as I did. I will leave all the information about the books, the movie, and the documentary down in the description box so you can check that out. If you were interested in this, I really recommend that you check out things about it. I'll also leave a link to that YouTube channel that Michael Alig did with Ernie Glam, because I think that that really gives some good insight into Michael Alig. If you have any feelings about this case, I hope that you'll leave a comment for me so we can discuss it down there. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe if you want to keep up with these videos. Other than that, I'll say bye and I'll see you next time.